There is too much beauty in this world to give up on it yet. And it is always too soon to surrender to cynicism. So bring your doubt, your skepticism, your downright confusion, even your bitterness and your heartbreak. But in the midst of all of these, in the center, wrap your tender fingers around a still bright thread of hope. Feel in your heart that still, steady hunger for something more. The vision we glimpse every day in the rising sun across the foothills, the light that spreads across the face of the one we love, the look of knowing all there is to know, and still loving life, loving us. Just as it is, just as we are. For this hour, we come to celebrate, to praise, to give thanks, to refuse to give up, to steady ourselves, keepers of hope and peace and joy and love, brave builders of this still possible world. Come, let us worship together.
The second candle in our Advent wreath will be lit this morning, and interpretations vary, but in many traditions, we honor the second candle as a candle for peace. Growing up, my parents had a piece of artwork on their wall that read, "At the table of peace will be bread and justice." It was a print from the Syracuse Cultural Workers, text by Nedra Ruiz. And so may we set our metaphorical tables with bread for all who are hungry and with justice to right all wrongs, that we may have peace. Welcome. Welcome this morning to everyone who is here in the sanctuary and everyone who is here on Zoom and those who are spread out nicely socially distanced in the gallery upstairs. We're really grateful that we can be together, though our numbers are more limited as we are still on an upward spike from Thanksgiving and Omicron, perhaps. And we are in that red, very high transmission phase, and so in that phase, we have reduced our capacity again to 35 in the sanctuary. But we really appreciate everyone cooperating, wearing your masks, socially distancing, signing in, and following all those protocols that our reopening task force has put out to keep us safe. As always, we appreciate your feedback, and as always, we will be monitoring situations and trying to make the best decisions we can to be together as much as possible and be as safe as possible. In terms of announcements, we are collecting new and unused Christmas cards for the men who are living in the Billerica jail. And so please bring cards with envelopes that can be used so they can send greeting cards. There is a box at the Elm Street entrance, and they can be dropped off also at Joanne Glover's house at 85 Fletcher Road. And the deadline is noon on December 12th. So thanks to everyone who contributes in that way. I also want to wish a happy Hanukkah to those who have been celebrating this week and acknowledge our beautiful menorah, thanks to Lori Groves, so appreciating that we can add this today to our chancel. This afternoon, there is a lyceum with our own Brad Conner speaking about the bells of Christmas and the significance of bells in many different circumstances, and so you will want to check that out, 3 p.m. today on Zoom. And then this coming weekend on Friday and Saturday evening, we're going to have a labyrinth experience in our common room. It will be a meditative, seasonal time from 5 to 8:30 p.m. You can come by and you can move through the labyrinth at your own pace, and we trust that people will come at such a rate that we will be all set with our COVID limits. So please come for a meditative evening moment this Friday and Saturday evening. And with that, I invite you to rise in body or in spirit, as suits you, to join in our unison affirmation. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. El amor es el espíritu de esta iglesia, y el servicio es su ley. Este es nuestro gran pacto, vivir juntos en paz, buscar la verdad en el amor, y ayudarnos los unos a los otros.
This morning I want to share with you an adaptation of the story of Chanukah as adapted from the writings of Tracy and Paul Larue. The story of Chanukah begins in the reign of Alexander the Great. Alexander conquered Syria and Egypt and Palestine, but allowed the lands under his control to observe their own religions and retain a certain degree of autonomy. Under this relatively benevolent rule, many Jews assimilated much of the Hellenistic culture, adapting the language and the customs and the dress of the Greeks in much the same way that Jews in America today blend into the secular American society. More than a century later, a successor of Alexander, Antiochus IV, was in control of the region, and he began to oppress the Jews severely, placing a Hellenistic priest in the temple, massacring Jews, prohibiting the practice of the Jewish religion, and desecrating the temple by requiring the sacrifice of pigs, a non-kosher animal, on the altar. Judah the Maccabee led a revolt against the Syrians. He had a small band of followers which could not confront the Syrian military in conventional warfare, so he used unusual tactics, guerrilla tactics, that were successful. When Judah defeated the Syrians and re-entered Jerusalem, he ordered the temple cleansed and rededicated. This involved rekindling the eternal flame. Sacred oil had to be prepared as fuel for the flame, but it would take 8 days to prepare the oil. According to the tradition, a small amount of sacred oil, sufficient for only 1 day, was found hidden in the temple. So the lamp was kindled, and miraculously, it continued to burn for 8 days, long enough for a new supply of oil to be prepared. So it is that the Chanukah candles are kindled, an additional candle each night for 8 nights during Chanukah. This morning we retelled this story of Chanukah in honor of our friends and our neighbors who continue to celebrate through tomorrow night. Here ends our first reading.
So actually, I'm going to add an extra post-joys and concerns joy. I'm really thankful for all the people who run the tech for these services. As I said yesterday at the the bell ringing concert, which went very well and had a lot of technical backup so that people could tune in from outside because we were restricted in our numbers here. It's the same this morning. I mean, so many people were able to join us. Think if this were 10 years ago, we would not have had any of this. And that would have been truly heartbreaking and difficult for all of us. So thank you, each and everyone who contributes to that. Also, I want to bring up that our Holy Family is peacefully making their way around the ledge here. They're further here. I know you folks at home are going to have to imagine that, and maybe next week we'll be able to send you a couple of pictures so that you can see it too. But they're quietly doing that, and it totally fits with our theme of the morning, which is peace. And for the offertory today, it is a Share the Plate Sunday, and I'm going to ask Marge Heckman to come forward and introduce our speaker.
Good morning. I'm Marge Heckman, and I'm chair of the Social Responsibility Council here at First Parish. And as Brad said, this is our Share the Plate Sunday. And this week, our offerings are going to be shared with the UU Church in Concord, their committee that is working with resettlement of Afghan refugees. So I'm going to let Ted Bain from our Concord UU Church come up and tell us a little bit about their efforts.
Thank you for having me. I'll stand a little closer. Yeah, I'm very familiar with this church because we did support at Concord. In fact, the Immigration Justice Task Force all participated in the Sanctuary for Maria, and it was wonderful to meet more people. There were 200 people in that group, and it was a building exercise. Maria was very important, and we all loved her, but the fact is that the Sanctuary group still exists, and they're participating in other things. So it got the ball rolling. The Immigration Task Force at First Parish Concord formed a subgroup that is focused on the Afghan crisis. And there are plenty of groups around the country. I looked at a map of state by state by state, and most states have programs that are settling Afghan refugees. And you can click on the state and see how many they were allotted. And I think Massachusetts was allotted 1,100. Our group is working with International Institute of New England, which is a very old immigration group that started with the YW. They're based in Lowell originally, and they became an independent refugee help group at some point in the 20s, but they really go back. And we didn't know who to work with. It's a very complicated landscape in terms of there's so many small groups. Some are just individuals, sometimes it's just churches. In our case, Karim Shalom basically had a social responsibility group, and they're working with us for one of the families. One of the families is a pair of sisters who found a studio apartment in Concord, rent-free. So we're supporting them with an interfaith alliance with Karim Shalom. The big bomb that happened was we got assigned a family of 12. And we went to Manchester. We didn't know when they were coming in, the scant information about them. And so there we are at 1:30 a.m. in Manchester waiting for this group to come. And we had two signs, one in Pashtun and one in Dari. Those are the two popular languages in Afghanistan. So our translator, who himself was a refugee years ago, now lives in Maynard, was there, and he was listening for voices so we'd tell which sign to put up. And he picked up a few syllables. It didn't take very much for him to know that it wasn't Pashtun, it was Dari. So the Dari sign went up. And so that was our people. And basically the 12 people consisted of some cousins, because there was a parent that didn't make it. So we had basically one biological father and an aunt, and a whole slew of kids, all different age groups. And I was up there yesterday basically playing Crazy Eights. Now, it's amazing to think that you could play Crazy Eights with kids that don't know any English at all, and they know little snippets of it. But it was a great game. It was a great game. It's a very different experience to have 12 people in a small living room. We were there. I was there with Tony Rodriguez. I'm sure some people know here, and his wife. And we were there installing Wi-Fi and internet that they dearly wanted. Now we have to find some laptops, but their phones very much appreciated the Wi-Fi once we got it going. But I think your approach to use Share the Plate is a good idea, and we'll much appreciate it. We're just one small effort. I know there are individuals and organizations all across the country that are helping these wonderful people, and it's amazing how generous they are, the smiles and the humor, and I think they'll learn English and they'll be a big contributor to our society. So thank you for having me.
This reading is from The First Christmas by Marcus J. Borg and John Dominic Crossan. In scholarship's best reconstruction, Jesus was born just before the death of Herod the Great in 4 BCE. But upon that death, there were uprisings all over the Jewish homeland, and some of them had clearly messianic overtones. Violent attempts to replace an unjust and Rome-appointed tyrant with a just and God-appointed ruler. In order to put down these rebellions, the Syrian legions guarding the Euphrates frontier came not only to fight, but to punish as well. When we are finished with you this time, they said, we will not have to return for a couple generations. There was, among those rebellions, one at Sepphoris, capital of the Galilee, just a few miles from Nazareth. The governor, Varus sent about 18,000 elite troops, accompanied by 2,000 auxiliary cavalry and 1,500 auxiliary infantry. Their staging area was due west of Sepphoris. Then, as Varus took his main force south, he, quote, at once sent a detachment of his army into the region of Galilee, under the command of his friend Gaius, who routed all who opposed him, captured and burnt the city of Sepphoris, and reduced its inhabitants to slavery. What do you think happened to the small adjacent villages when the legions struck their local city with fire and sword? What do you think happened in Nazareth, a tiny hamlet about 4 miles or an hour and a half's walk over the Nazareth Ridge and across the floor of the Beth Netophah Valley? Jesus grew up in Nazareth after 4 BCE, so this is our claim. The major event in his village's life was the day the Romans came.
The great theologian Karl Barth is often alleged to have said that every preacher should preach with a newspaper in one hand and the Bible in the other. That's what I feel called to do today, in a sense, beginning with the news. Goodness gracious, what a lot of crappy things we had happen this week. We're beginning to learn more about the variant of concern that is Omicron, which seems to be highly transmissible and is making its way across the globe, and which has arrived in Massachusetts. The first news of Omicron came on the heels of what felt like a sudden and explosive jump in new confirmed case numbers in Massachusetts before Thanksgiving even happened. Accelerating this past week, we went, for those of you who don't pay close attention to the numbers, from just under 3,000 new confirmed cases on Tuesday to almost 5,000 on Wednesday, and then beyond on Thursday and Friday. Hospitalizations are going up, and UMass Memorial in Worcester has reported that they no longer have any available beds in their ICU. On top of that, we learned, of course, of the tragic school shooting in Michigan this week that took the lives of 4 students and injured 7 others. And many of us listened in as the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in a Mississippi case, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, the only licensed abortion clinic left in Mississippi, by the way, that could ultimately lead to the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and which some experts tell us could, in turn, undermine laws that protect the rights of women to use contraceptives and the right of same-sex marriage, among other rights. All of that was happening under the shadow of yet another potential government shutdown, which Friday was averted temporarily until February, but the threat of the debt ceiling will not be raised is still looming over our heads for another 10 days. Is the onslaught of the retrospectively bad news week over yet? No, it's not, because while all of that was happening, accusers in the Ghislaine Maxwell trial began their grisly testimony. We heard some of that on the news. The January 6th Commission continues its investigation of the insurrection at the Capitol. Voter suppression efforts continued across the country, reminding us of the ongoing, persistent, and aggressive threat to democracy in this country. And for those of you paying attention to Europe, Russia continued both its buildup of troops on the borders of Ukraine and its saber-rattling rhetoric, leading experts to wonder if a new invasion of sovereign Ukraine is imminent. I'm sure I'm probably missing something, but that feels like an awful lot, and it was that kind of week. It was a lot for anyone's already frazzled nerve system to take. It was the kind of news week that may have triggered past trauma for some people. It was the kind of week that may at least have left you feeling angry, sad, afraid, overwhelmed, anxious. I want to say a special word about anxiety this week. Anxiety is an automatic reaction to a threat, either real or imagined. It comes from an interesting family of words. Its root words mean to choke or to strangle. Anake was the name of the Greek god who was the Greek god of constraint who presided over slavery. And the same word, Anake, referred to yokes or rings that wound around the neck of slaves. Other words related to anxiety include angst, angina, the tight sensation in the chest that accompanies the feeling of dread. Anxiety can deplete our energy, disturb our thinking, arouse feelings of helplessness. If you found yourself feeling anxious this past week, know that you are not alone. I hope that you will continue to do the things that you need to do to take care of yourselves during this difficult time. That may include taking a break from the news. It may include focusing on eating more healthy foods and exercising and trying to get more sleep. It may include cutting back on caffeine and alcohol consumption and drinking more water and more chamomile tea. It may include calling a family member or a good friend or even one of your ministers to help you regain some perspective and to recenter yourselves. I had a conversation this week with a trusted colleague of mine at the height of my own anxiety in relation to the news, in which I mentioned that I was planning to preach something related to Advent and tyranny and hope and peace and blah, blah, blah. But at the minute, I was hardly able to think myself out of a plain paper bag. And she said what you would expect any friend or colleague or loving family member to say. She said, "You'll be fine. I believe in you. You can do it." But then she said something interesting. She said, "You know, authoritarianism is one response to anxiety." And you know what? She was absolutely right. When we are anxious, we long for simplicity, for clarity, for order, and for quick fixes. And authoritarian regimes promise exactly those things, don't they? When we are anxious, we get more reactive. We blame others more often for our problems. We criticize others more harshly. We create scapegoats that we then try to cast out from our midst or destroy. We think in terms of black and white, us versus them, and authoritarian regimes love that stuff. They thrive on those behaviors. In fact, they do whatever they can to heighten and exacerbate them. I'm reminded of the Bible, of the passage from the Gospel of Mark where Pontius Pilate offers to release Jesus after his trial, finding him insufficiently guilty. But the religious leaders, according to that account, stir up the crowds. These are the same crowds that only days before were showing up en masse to hear Jesus preach the good news. But the authorities stir up the crowds who then demand that Jesus be crucified. I used to think of that short passage in Mark whenever I would hear the voice of the former president at his rallies, stirring up the crowds. Stirring up our anxiety is precisely what rising authoritarians want to do. And so it must be said that one underrated way of resisting tyranny is learning how to better manage our anxiety. Now, before I go on, I just want to say a word about the readings this morning. Readings can do different things in a service. They can serve different purposes. Sometimes they introduce a novel idea or they set a particular mood for the week. This week, I simply wanted them to serve to help provide some historical context. Amid the joy and the celebration of the holiday season, amid the menorahs and the Hanukkah gifts and the Advent calendars and the carols and the Christmas lights, they remind us that both the Hanukkah story and the Christmas story are rooted historically in times of struggle, of political unrest, of violence, and of tyranny. The people then must have felt pretty anxious too. Now, like everything religious and historical, both stories can be interpreted and have been interpreted in different ways. Rabbi Brad Hirschfield had an essay in the Washington Post this week titled "Celebrating the Insurrection of Hanukkah in a Year of Insurrection," in which he said of the Hanukkah story that some tell it as an insurrection of deeply religious country folk overthrowing wealthy cosmopolitan elites who were washing out the greatness of their nation. Others imagine Hanukkah as a war for political liberation from colonist overlords imposing anti-democratic, imperialist, patriarchal rule over an indigenous people. Two very different interpretations of the story, both perhaps with some truth. Similarly, the Christmas story and the narrative of Advent is sometimes described as a time of waiting for the second coming of Christ, who will come like a strong man, heavily armed, bearing a sword to save the righteous and to violently punish the unrighteous. Or it can be told as a time of waiting for the birth of a small baby, the child of an unwed migrant woman of color, who will grow up to bring good news to the poor and the oppressed and signal the end of earthly tyranny through the transformative power of God's love. That story, that version of the story, is clearly my preference, more aligned with our liberal religious tradition as Unitarian Universalists. And I appreciate, especially this year, the annual reminder that the small can overcome the large, that the least can, in fact, be first, that love can overcome the tyrannies of fear and violence and injustice and oppression. Now, like Hanukkah and Christmas, Advent itself can be celebrated in different ways. When I was young, I remember being taught that I should focus on the virtues that we celebrate when we light each candle each week: hope and peace, joy and love, sometimes faith, depending on your tradition. And I should try simply to be more hopeful and more peaceful and more joyful and more loving during the month of December leading up to Christmas. As I got older, probably as I started paying attention to the news around me, I started to struggle more and more with that interpretation of Advent. Geez, I mean, the world is pretty broken and scary. It can be hard to look at what is going on in the world and to feel hopeful or to feel peaceful or joyful or loving. The temptation is to look away, to try to ignore or turn off all that brokenness, to focus on the tinsel and the lights and the trees and the cookies. Just trust, we were told as children, just trust. Some voices counsel, just trust that everything will be okay, and just get back to focusing on hope and on peace and on joy and on love. But turning away, trying to ignore all that stuff, trying to deny it, all of those things are anxious responses. Anxiety is something that moves us to disengage because we're uncomfortable, to cut off that which is uncomfortable. But the anxiety, even when we try to do that, persists. This year, the parish board has committed to reading and discussing a book called Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times, Being Calm and Courageous No Matter What, by church consultant Peter Steinke. The book really is a coaching guide for helping leaders to develop the capacity to function as non-anxious presences in the midst of anxious congregations. Not to get rid of anxiety, because that's impossible, but to function in the midst of it, to learn to manage our own natural reactions to anxiety, to keep calm for the purpose of reflection and conversation, to learn to tolerate high degrees of uncertainty and frustration and pain, to learn to better maintain a clear sense of direction. As Peter Steinke says, the non-anxious presence involves engagement, being there and taking the heat if need be, witnessing the pain and yet not fighting fire with fire. The non-anxious presence means we are aware of our own anxiety and the anxiety of others, but we will not let either determine our actions. Obviously, he says, this means that we have to have some capacity to tolerate pain, both in ourselves and in others. So I'm going to argue this morning that trying to be hopeful and peaceful and joyful and loving while simultaneously trying to disengage from the world or to ignore the pain of the world is kind of an anxious way to celebrate Advent. And I'm going to suggest that there is another way that's rooted biblically, actually. Last week, many of you may not know this because we don't follow the lectionary here at First Parish, but last week one of the lectionary readings for Advent was from Luke 21. And just to sum it up, Luke is saying that all sorts of bad things are going to happen. I won't even go into them. We've heard enough bad things today, but lots of bad things are going to happen. And the author of Luke says that even though these awful and frightening things will occur, our job is to stay watchful, to pay attention, all the while taking heed of ourselves, lest our hearts be weighed down with dissipation. In other words, watch, but try not to get pulled apart by your anxiety. This morning, I want to invite you to imagine that Advent might be a call to practice non-anxious presence, a call to practice managing our reactivity, a call to practice self-regulating. What if Advent is a call to engaging in practices that increase our emotional maturity in the midst of anxiety? I return to these four virtues, hope and peace and love and joy, for which we light the candles each week in our Advent wreath. There is a kind of anxious hope, I want to argue, that looks away from all the brokenness and passively waits for someone or something to save us. And there is also a mature hope that is not passive but is active, which is not a feeling but an action, something that one does. As journalist and activist Chris Hedges once wrote, hope is something you do. He says hope is not about peace of mind, it is an action. It is about doing something. The more futile, the more useless, the more irrelevant and incomprehensible an act of rebellion is, the vaster and more potent hope becomes. All who resist, he says, keep hope alive. He continues by saying, and he wrote this in 2010, I cannot tell you these years of war will end or that the hungry will be fed. I cannot say that justice will roll down like a mighty wave and restore our nation to sanity, but I can say this. If we resist and carry out acts, no matter how small, of open defiance, hope will not be extinguished. If all we accomplish is to assure a grieving mother in Baghdad or Afghanistan, a young man or woman crippled physically or emotionally by the hammer blows of war, that he or she is not alone, our resistance will be successful. Hope, he says, cannot be sustained if it cannot be seen. Likewise, I want to argue that there is a kind of anxious peace that says that peace comes with order, that we should suppress divergent voices and sweep differences under the rug and avoid conflict by enforcing conformity, that we should turn off the noise so that we can find peace. And there is a more mature peace that is willing to still allow diverse voices to be heard, that stays at the table even when things are uncomfortable, and stays engaged even when it is hard. A peace that finds peace in the midst of chaos rather than in its absence. Similarly, I want to say that there's an anxious kind of joy that tries to ignore or suppress the pain, a Pollyanna type of joy that puts on a happy face even when it is sad inside. And there is a mature joy, expressed well, I think, in Wendell Berry's poem about the mad farmer, in which he says, "So, friends, every day do something that won't compute. Love someone who does not deserve it, denounce the government and embrace the flag, hope to live in that free republic for which it stands, expect the end of the world, laugh. Laughter is immeasurable. Be joyful, though you have considered all the facts." And finally, there is an anxious kind of love that only allows us to be loving to those who are like us and to those with whom we agree. And there is a mature kind of love that calls us to love one another, even the stranger, even the enemy. Again, as Wendell Berry says, love someone who does not deserve it. This is a love that won't allow us to divide ourselves into an us versus a them, but which calls us instead to acknowledge whatever our differences are, and then to go ahead and do what it is that love does. And what does love do? Again, the Bible in this hand, as it says in 1 Corinthians, love is kind and patient and never jealous, boastful, proud, or rude, never selfish or quick-tempered. Love doesn't keep a record of wrongs that others do. Love is always supportive and hopeful and trusting. Love doesn't insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. This is a passage that is probably familiar to most of you from weddings. It's often read at weddings. But we should never forget that it was first addressed to the members of a church in Corinth who were struggling during anxious times. Perhaps we can see this Advent then as an invitation not to look away, but to look the world squarely in the eye, to acknowledge all of its brokenness, and to practice hoping anyway, to practice finding peace in its midst, to practice being joyful despite what we know, and to practice the kind of love that is radical and subversive and that can one day turn the world upside down, or rather, right side up. If we can stay both engaged in the world, and if we can keep those things alive, those small kernels of hope and peace and joy and love, then perhaps evil will not overcome us, and goodness and kindness will prevail in the end. May it In closing, I offer you these words from Jan Richardson from one of her poems called How the Light Comes. I cannot tell you how the light comes. What I know is that it is more ancient than imagining, that it travels across an astounding expanse to reach us, that it loves searching out what is hidden, what is lost, what is forgotten, what is in peril, what is in pain. I cannot tell you how the light comes, but that it does, that it will, that it works its way into the deepest dark that enfolds you, though it may seem long ages in coming or arrive in a shape that you did not foresee. And so may we this day turn ourselves toward it. May we lift our faces to let it find us. May we bend our bodies to follow the arc that it makes. May we open and open more and open still more to the blessed light that comes.